are talking 13 Fanboy, and this one is directed by Deborah Voorhees, who actually has a role in the movie as well. Now this has a recognisable cast of actors who you'll know from, among other things, but mainly the Friday the 13th series, and it plays a big factor in this movie. The one I was actually most excited to see was Judie Aronson, because I actually liked her in Weird Science rather than the kind of Friday the 13th movies. But you've got recognisable faces such as Dee Wallace, Feldman, Kane Hodder, among many others. Now this is a very meta slasher movie, and it actually feels more along the lines of Scream than the Friday the 13th movies, of which this is clearly obviously influenced. But essentially you have a slasher, ultimately, a guy who is, you know, obsessed with the Friday the 13th series, can't kind of detach himself from the reality of you know, versus kind of the fantasy of movies, and has somewhat of an obsession with the kind of the actresses from those movies, and decides he's going to kill them all, and basically anyone else who crosses paths with him at the same kind of time. And we have this kind of meta narrative where we have the, you know, fictionalized versions of these kind of these actors and actresses playing kind of themselves, ultimately trying to you know, see if they can kind of survive this kind of onslaught of their kind of peers. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So before we get into what I liked and what I didn't like, let me just address how I sit with kind of slasher films, because I feel I have to say this more or less every time I will review a slasher film, but this one feels particularly pertinent. So I am a movie fan, I'm a horror fan, but I'm not a big slasher fan. I find the genre very samey, full of tropes, and not really much originality. And I will say that this movie does have at least somewhat of an original idea here. And the reason I say this over any other kind of subgenre is because there is a large degree of gatekeeping, I feel, especially with the kind of slasher genre. In fact, I did a live stream about the Halloween Kills movie a little while ago, you know, literally a week ago, before I doing this review, and there was someone commenting there, "Why are you doing a live stream? You haven't even seen all the Halloween films and stuff." So, can I understand the premise of the movie, so to speak? And it's weird because it just, in slasher fans in particular, you never really see like creature feature fans or possession movie fans being quite so tribal as you do with slasher fans, in a positive way as well. But you know, there is a little bit of gatekeeping, I do feel, which kind of leads me into the kind of the premise of this movie, where we have an obsessed fan, ultimately, or that's kind of the setup, and you know, we have these actors playing like fictionalized versions of themselves, having to deal with the kind of like, you know, the day-to-day life of being a kind of a character actor, going to conventions, kind of, you know, securing roles and things like that. So it's a kind of a fun peek behind the camera, but it also deals with fandom and how kind of maybe people are putting him on pedestals. And I think one of the key strengths of this movie is the fact that it has this kind of this interesting kind of meta narrative that is really, I would say, certainly more in tune, I think, with than fans, and even maybe the Scream films, which is obviously more of a mainstream film here, the Scream films. This one, I think, is really trying to go for the more kind of hardcore kind of like horror fans and things like that. It just seems to me, and it's an interesting. It's even more meta than Scream in a way, and therefore it's quite interesting having these kind of like, you know, fictionalized versions of kind of characters and kind of how they would interact with each other. And you do get a sense that, for example, when we see kind of like the people at the conventions, how they're kind of interacting with each other. So there is kind of quite a neat peek behind the curtain, so to speak, of that community of kind of character actors, ones who are maybe certainly not A-list, but they're still kind of carving out and living in kind of really you know, having a name for themselves in this particular kind of fan community. So I found that concept, you know, quite intriguing, and the whole idea here of having this very kind of meta kind of slasher film, and also the legal manoeuvring, how to kind of get around that quagmire of legal issues that the Friday the 13th movie sort of franchise has at the moment. This is a neat idea to kind of try and sidestep it without kind of doing an out-and-out kind of fan film and having a film about the Friday the 13th with kind of a different killer, so to speak. So I found the concept of that very intriguing, and like I said, I'm not the biggest slasher fan. And this is kind of why I always have to feel I have to justify whenever I review a slasher film, so to speak. But I do appreciate it when filmmakers can inject some originality into these proceedings, because there's a lot that don't. And so I do appreciate the attempt to have originality in a kind of very tried and tested subgenre. It's also nice to see a lot of kind of recognisable faces here in a film together. And part of the fun for me was seeing these kind of actors playing, versions of themselves, so to speak, just kind of interacting, and you kind of imagine almost that this is maybe what it's like. Obviously, this is a, hyper-realised version of that, so it's not going to be quite as dramatic, I shouldn't think, but, that was all kind of quite fun. The other thing I think this movie sticks the landing on is some of the death scenes. This movie does have some problems, but one thing it gets right, I think, is some very kind of well-realised death scenes. Now, again, going back to kind of subgenres, I feel one of the things I see quite often, what's your favourite death scene in a kind of a slasher, in a horror film? And they're often slasher movies, kind of when people sort of say that. So kind of like gruesome death scenes are one of the kind of the key staples to slasher films, and I think that really they do a good job in kind of keeping that kind of tradition going. And I have to say, if you are a really big slasher fan, this movie is really made for you, and I think you'd probably appreciate more than most, more than me, because I got to tell you, outside of those elements that I've kind of given it praise for, I found this movie incredibly hard to watch. And I'm going to explain why that is, why I feel this way. Okay, the biggest issue for me here, by far and away, let me get the big one out of the way, is the narrative here is terrible. It is a poorly written movie. Scenes just don't flow together. The narrative kind of like flow of this movie is terrible. You have no real kind of sense of time where these things are kind of like, these sequences are happening. I mean, it's a linear film that you kind of see things in, they're not just kind of going back in time and things like that, but you don't really get a sense of kind of how long this kind of movie is meant to be taking, but what the kind of time periods are. You don't really follow a kind of essential character. We have this kind of like, an actress playing like a different character, not a kind of playing herself, who I guess is the central protagonist. But to be honest with you, I don't really feel like we followed her as much as maybe we should have. Spending a lot of time dealing, having kind of screen time with the kind of the casts of the, the original Friday the 13th movies. And as such, it kind of undercuts what is meant to be our main character and things like this. But the narrative here was just terrible, I thought. And like I said, it borrows more from the Scream movies than from Friday the 13th. But obviously, that's still in the kind of the slasher genre. I don't really want to go into spoilers necessarily, but just the kind of the way this movie is written, the script is extremely poor. You fail to understand the situations that the characters are in. We go from, it seems to kind of lurch from one scene to the next, and then we have these, character interactions. For example, there's a scene where Dee Wallace is kind of like essentially kind of breaking down when she's kind of finding something kind of untoward, so to speak, and thinking, why isn't she kind of like, there's someone else just there, someone who she can talk to, but she's choosing not to. There's just scenes here that are just don't make any sense. It's a one garbage scene after another garbage scene with very kind of little narrative to kind of like guide you through, and the kind of like the story that we do have is just jumbled and kind of all over the place. The editing also on top of this is terrible. And it goes into that. It just lurches from one scene to another. There's some really kind of poorly edited kind of sequences and things like that. That again make this for a hard movie to watch. I've got to say the acting isn't particularly good. Not from everyone. but the acting here, even from some of the kind of the veteran actors, I gotta say I didn't think was particularly good. I suspect this was a very short shoot, and people are just kind of like rattling off kind of somewhat improvised lines to a certain degree. But that's how it seems. But the acting here isn't great. The killer, again, we try and have a little bit of a kind of a, again, maybe twist on the genre, but it's somewhat reminiscent of, as I say, the Scream kind of movies, without kind of giving anything away there. But it's ultimately somewhat of a disappointing antagonist. Kind of looks somewhat generic. You would have thought a movie based on obviously a very well-known and existing kind of horror franchise would know how to make an interesting antagonist, but it doesn't. And it's just some of the worst cheesy dialogue and things like this. I mean, I feel the movie is trying to have a commentary on horror films, but then doesn't get it, but it still falls into the same cliche traps that the horror film does. It's kind of, you know, so it's not really having any commentary on it, it's just kind of rehashing it. The other thing this movie does a little bit too much is kind of like trying to pimp itself out and kind of other Friday the 13th kind of things. It's like, oh look, here's the kind of the director of Never High Cologne, a great kind of fan film, and then we'll have a little scene about that and lots of kind of like graphics on screen. Never High Cologne, go watch that one. So he can kind of talk about it. Let's have some horror YouTubers. There's their kind of names, and they'll be in a bit of the film so they can talk about it on their channels. It feels like an exercise in marketing, this movie, or guerrilla marketing, and it's so kind of like, it's so obvious. I mean, thank Christ they use ones other than Cool Dude for a change, but you know, it really kind of, it's just so tacky, I have to say, and it's too long. The movie it's not a massively long film, but this could have had 15 minutes kind of chopped off and it'd be a lot punchier film. The movie drags. You feel like it's kind of like not really going anywhere, and that's again down to this kind of like the really kind of poor narrative and the script here. The directing also is not particularly strong, I have to say. It really doesn't take you on a kind of a journey, I feel, this movie, and you as a viewer. Now, I feel that there are going to be slasher fans who will just defend this movie because it's about their kind of genre, it's about their kind of favourite franchise, it's got their kind of favourite actors in it, and I don't think some people will be able to look at this in a critical sense. So as I've said, my position is I'm a horror fan, but I'm not really a slasher fan, so I'm coming at it from just a kind of a very kind of critical and outsider perspective. I do feel there's more value, certainly, if you are a slasher fan. It's certainly a movie that would appeal to you more than I think maybe someone who just likes horror films, like myself, for example. But I think that's more of, I don't think it's necessarily to do with the quality of the film. I think that's because you just really like the kind of the source and the material that it's kind of talking about here. I think if you genuinely critically have a look at this, it falls quite short. But I do appreciate the originality. I do appreciate the kind of the craft in regards to kind of the special effects. And it was fun to see all these kind of actors, albeit some of them don't make sense. Like you've got Corey Feldman playing not Corey Feldman, but he was in the kind of the Friday the 13th franchise. Well, how does that work? You know, but everyone else is kind of playing themselves. It was like, that kind of doesn't really make sense on a narrative. If you're going to have Corey Feldman in it, surely you want him to play Corey Feldman because he was in one of the Friday the 13th films. Just get another actor to play that. Movie producer didn't really understand that decision. There you go. This was not one I really enjoyed. It was a hard watch. For me, it's a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.